Hello everyone, and welcome to a video by Fuzzy Theory. We're here to answer a question you may not have known you had. Why does the West love Buddhism? Buddhism is the archetypical version of Asian spirituality that evokes haunting landscapes, wise monks, and ancient teachings. The West has loved Buddhism since it first encountered it. Still today, we can see the love for Buddhism with a quick Google search. Here, we see the Zook himself praising Buddhism. There are many articles about how Buddhism was considered the best religion in a vote of religious leaders. We now know that this news is fake, but its very believability speaks to what we think in the West. A colleague in Buddhist studies attempted to get a handle on this question for the BBC, and the title says it all. If you do the research, you can see that Buddhism has been hip for almost 200 years. A quick Google search asking if Buddhism is better than your religion gives us 32 million hits. People engaging with the idea that Buddhism is somehow special is very popular, whether or not they agree with the premise. This shows us that the idea of a pristine Buddhism is very well developed. Now that we have briefly given some loose evidence for the West's love of Buddhism, the rest of the video will explain why this is the case. But first, to answer the question of why the West loves Buddhism, we need to understand what the West is. The first thing to note is that the West is an idea. The West as anything other than a location is what we call an ideological production. We can easily see this when we center ourselves in North America and point west. What is west of North America is in fact Asia, or what we call the East. And what is east is Europe, or the origins of the West. So we see here that west and east are not just directions, they are concepts. In order to understand the West as a concept, we have to understand its history, which I will only bring up briefly as it relates to our main question. The first thing to note about the West is that the idea of the West was constructed to unify European identity after over a century of internal war and conflict. Europe needed some way of unifying itself so it wouldn't keep tearing itself apart. The second thing to note is that embedded in the West is the sociological constant of us versus them. In order to create a Western us, Europe also constructed an other that the West can act upon. This other, the Orient or the East, is an unavoidable and necessary part of the concept of the West since its inception. So, the West is not just a place and not just a direction. The West is a concept and an ideological production. The big question to ask ourselves is, what does this ideological production we call the West do? The work of this ideological production is to reconcile the Enlightenment values of human rights and dignity with the colonial project of dehumanizing colonized subjects. The West was constructed in a time where Enlightenment values of universal human morality, dignity, and rights were in tension with the colonial project of dehumanizing colonized subjects. The West limits Enlightenment universal morality via a hierarchy of West over the East. In reality, West and the rest, because these processes happen everywhere, not just in Asia. The work of the ideological category of the West allows for the West to exert power over the other, the non-West, to extract resources without Enlightenment morality in the way. The binary of West and East serves to create a distinction that provides a rationale for the deuniversalization and dehumanization of the other. The West, as a concept, allows us to negate universal human rights. I've compiled a short list of some of the related elements that the East-West binary has evoked in the past and still evokes today. Note that this list is not about facts. All of these relations between East and West and their stereotypes are ideological constructs to favor the West. This is why the concept of the West is an ideological production. All of these elements of the list were just made up by the West for the West. And yet, because of the epistemic and political power of the West via colonialism, these binaries became believed and developed a kind of reality. If we go through them, we'll see how they work. If the East is irrational and the West rational, then this justifies Western intervention. It means the West need not listen to the East if it is irrational. It means the West must bring rationality to the East via colonialism. If the East is barbaric or savage, it isn't subject to rational Enlightenment norms, and thus the West justifies its colonial interventions because the East is subhuman. If the East is traditional and the West is modern, then colonial impositions of modernity are thus the only rational outcome. And finally, if the West is materialistic and the East spiritual, then modern rational science supersedes Asian superstition and further supports colonial intervention. How does all of this relate to Buddhism in the West? We will get there, but to start, what we now call Asian spirituality is in many ways a response to this colonial project that produces a West and an East. There are two responses to consider here towards the idea that the West is materialistic and the East is spiritual. The first response is an anti-colonial response that doubles down on the idea that the East is more spiritual. Asians say, yes, it is true that we are more spiritual, but that means we, with our Eastern spirituality, are better than the West. Eastern spirituality becomes a source of resistance to colonialism within Asia. We see the effects of this still today with fundamentalist Islam, Hindu nationalism, and various other forms of ethnocentric religiosity in the post-colonial period. These traditions can trace their roots all the way back to the 19th century. The second response to the idea that the East is more spiritual is a romanticist response to the Enlightenment project, where Westerners, alienated by modern rational efficiency, are looking for a more meaningful Western project. One thread within Romanticist ideals is the search for origins, the search for a new renaissance in Europe, where the East can make up for Western lack. Embedded in the idea of the West since its construction is the idea that the West is too materialistic. What this produces is the desire to find spirituality in the East. Both Enlightenment and Romanticist ideals include the search for origins of civilization in the East. First Egypt, then Mesopotamia, then India become the site of the search for civilization. For the West, its civilizational origins are located in exotic, mystical, and mysterious Eastern spirituality. Now, of course, this also allows for more colonial intervention, as Westerners search for the origins of civilization that the East has lost. It is the West's duty to go there and find these origins, regardless of what Asians want. The Romanticist project of finding the West's soul in the East is still a rational exercise of locating Western spirituality. Romanticism and Enlightenment ideals join in trying to find a rational religion in the East. All of these processes that I've talked about coalesce at the exact time that Europeans discover Buddhism in the middle of the 19th century. Because Europeans were looking for original Buddhism, independent from the savage irrationality of the East, and independent from how actual Asians practiced Buddhism, Europeans, and especially the French and British, could create the ideal Buddhism that fit their needs. They could pick or choose those elements that they deemed to be most relevant for what to include in the category Buddhism. And those elements they included in their picture of Buddhism always served to match their own European desires. As Donald Lopez Jr. says in his book, Curators of the Buddha, on page 6, this Buddhism could thus serve as a substitute self for Victorian Britain, a self present long ago in the very heart of the Orient. This Buddhism is based on reason and restraint, opposed to ritual, superstition, and sacerdotalism. We see here that from its inception in the Western imagination, Buddhism was a substitute self in the West's search for its own civilizational origins. But what that practically entailed was that the West was able to construct Buddhism to fit all of its present needs and desires. We see this transformation happen over time in the history of which forms of Buddhism the West is most comfortable engaging with. So we see that in the late 19th and early 20th century, the most popular form of Buddhism was what we now call Theravada Buddhism. More specifically, the texts of Theravada Buddhism. The West was less concerned with actual Theravada Buddhist practices and Theravada Buddhist Asians, and more concerned with the texts that relate to original Buddhism, quote unquote. The West is more concerned with the texts as a representation of their desire for a rational religion. Thus, the Polytext Society could claim authority over the texts of Buddhism in order to find a rational religion that could compete and overcome the superstition of contemporary Christianity. So we see here that in the late 19th and early 20th century, the desire of the West for a rational religion shapes the kind of Buddhism it finds. This happens again in the 1950s. After the post-World War II period, we see a number of movements within the West to make sense of World War II. We find existentialism that blames World War II on an over-rationalization, on hyper-efficiency, and the Buddhist equivalent of that becomes Zen Buddhism. And in fact, in the 1950s, the most popular form of Buddhism in the West is Zen. We see this through the Beat poets, Allen Ginsberg, Alan Watts, Jack Kerouac. Zen Buddhism, as a response to World War II, can invoke the mystical, the irrational, the paradoxical in response to the over-rationality that led to World War II. And yet, Zen Buddhism can still remain intellectual. In the 1980s, Tibetan Buddhism becomes the most popular form of Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism looks and feels exotic and fits our newly liberal engagement with the other as a form of self-expression. It also fits our search for the last places that we can find mystery. Thus, the capital of Tibet, Lhasa, is associated with Shangri-La, the mythical place that fits in Western imagination. More importantly, however, Tibetan Buddhism becomes popular in the 1980s so that we can save it from non-Western imperial intervention. Thus, Tibetan Buddhism becomes a symbol of Western redemption. Our love for Tibetan Buddhism allows us to assuage our white guilt. When the West saves Tibetan Buddhism from China, it declares Western innocence. It allows us to redeem ourselves from our history of colonialism, as well as allowing us to take up this notion of the romantic substitute self that we see in the Victorian period. As we can see, Buddhism has always been a kind of foil for Western desire, and that is not less true today than it was in the 19th century. So the answer to the question, why does the West love Buddhism, is because Buddhism, from the start of its encounter with the West to the present, has always been there to fit Western desires. Buddhism was, from its very beginnings in its encounter with the West, designed to fit Western desires. It was first a rational religion for 19th century Romanticists, then became an irrational religion for a post-war critique of rationality, and then the 1980s, Buddhism assuaged our white guilt by letting us save it. Indeed, we can take this further. The question of whether Buddhism is a philosophy or a religion has nothing to do with Buddhism, and it has everything to do with our concern over what we want Buddhism to be. Today, I would argue that Buddhism fits neatly into our capitalist desire for decontextualized, depoliticized spirituality that allows us to meditate away the oppressions we face in an unequal society. But that is a topic for another video. Thank you for watching.